everybody. Welcome to the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. We are fortunate, along with Oxford University Press, to be hosting this event. The very, very weighty in more sense than term Handbook on National Security. But before we go into that, let me first ask Chirag Thakkar of Oxford University Press to introduce the book to you.
Thank you, Mr. Sinha.
For that, mobile phone, please. Please switch it off.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Chirag Thakkar. I am the commissioning editor.
Sorry to interview. Yeah, some young people, please come in front. There are ladies and all. आ जाओ यार, जवान आदमी हो यार. यार आगे आ जाओ यहाँ हो यार. Exactly. Yes. On a lighter tone, अगर सिविल सर्विस में आना है ना, तो बहुत घिसना पड़ता.
Well, good evening, everyone. I am Chirag. I curate the politics list at Oxford University Press India. And I'm delighted to welcome each one of you at the launch and discussion of the Oxford Handbook of India's National Security, edited by SUMIT GANGULY, NICOLAS BLAREL, and MANJEET Pardesi. A brief note on the editors of the handbook, who you all know, but I have to do this. Sumit Ganguly is a distinguished professor and holds the Rabindranath Tagore Chair in Indian Cultures and Civilizations at Indiana University, Bloomington, USA. Nicola teaches international relations at Leiden University, the Netherlands. And Manjeet teaches international relations in the School of History, Philosophy, Political Science, and International Relations at Victoria University, Wellington, New Zealand. Oxford handbooks are among the most prestigious and successful programs of Oxford's scholarly publishing, curating in-depth and cutting-edge contributions from leading and rising scholars from their respective fields. Meant as a go-to source for a comprehensive survey of emerging areas and established fields of research, these handbooks are spread across almost all major disciplines in the social sciences and humanities, with, for us, a defined focus on Asia and South Asia. The handbook of the moment that we are all here to celebrate is the first comprehensive work that offers analyses of the major national security challenges that we're being faced with essays covering themes such as colonial legacy, India's wars, strategic culture, nuclear security, the role of space and cybersecurity, terrorism, internal insurgencies, and many others. This work bridges the gap in our traditional and received understanding of what national security ought to be or how it ought to be studied. Here's a handbook that's of use to scholars, researchers, academics, practitioners, and the informed and the curious reader in understanding the relationship between national security and state-making in India. Oxford University Press is proud to have brought out this excellent collaborative conversation on India's national security by some of the finest, we believe, and some of the rising, promising political scientists, security studies experts, researchers, academics, among others. On the panel with us this evening are, of course, Mr. Shakti Sinha, Director of Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, moderating the discussion for us, with Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon, former National Security Advisor of India, C. Raja Mohan, Director with Carnegie India, and, of course, the editors of the handbook. Let me now invite the panel to formally unveil the handbook, and I then hand over to Mr. Sinha to set the discussion rolling. Thank you.
Thank you, Chirag. As he's rightly said, there are many good things to be said about this book. We will discuss, and I'll not take too much time. One good thing, of course, is that, yes, the definition of national security has widened a lot. It takes that into account. At the same time, even as it widens it, it keeps it focused. It doesn't become a fuzzy kind of a thing. The fear normally is if you keep on widening a thing beyond a point, everything is ambiguous. That is not there. The second, again, thing which I found very attractive about the book is the size of the chapters. 15, 20 pages with all these things. So it's very, you pick up just one thing, you want to know just one thing. Just read that. You don't have to read the others at all. And that makes it extremely useful for, if you want to ever work on something specific, it has it all there. Now what does come up to me, at least, in my little reading of the book, is that there's always an argument starting from Mr. George Stanham. Do we think strategically? Do we draw for history? I'll not go into that argument. Mr. Menon has points of view which I agree with. The point is that the trouble with a framework is it becomes too simplistic. Well, the world we live in is complex and contextual. We have always recognized we are not in the Indian scheme of things, in the Indic philosophies. We do not easily believe in black and white. And therefore, we don't want to be bound by rigid wordings. We like to take it contextually. That doesn't mean we are amoral. It does not mean we are amoral. It just means that we root it in context. And therefore, for an outsider who's looking for a specific formulation of a policy on national security or any aspect of national security, it's maddening to try to understand what these Indians are doing. And that is something I think which, if you read it carefully, a lot of it which is not so obvious becomes far more clearer. I leave it at that. We have an excellent panel, the three authors who have been introduced. Of course, Mr. YMC, of course, is already introduced, Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon. And Dr. Rajamohan, I'm particularly happy because he'll be leaving our shores for near abroad very, very soon. So I'm glad that Raj is here with us. So how do we start? Sumit, you and the two authors, editors, you, NICOLAS, MANJEET, and then me.
At the outset, let me thank my dear friend Shakti Sinha for organizing this book launch. I couldn't think of a better venue for doing this in New Delhi. And I'm obviously also grateful for OUP in reposing faith in us, in letting us undertake this massive enterprise, because this is not a trivial matter to undertake under any circumstances. And so I'm most grateful to Chirag Rekha Natarajan and her colleagues who had not only faith in this enterprise, but have supported us throughout the entire process, including Jai Prasad, who, alas, is no longer with OUP, but pursuing a PhD in Germany now. All of these people deserve suitable credit for all their extraordinary support and assistance. And obviously, I am deeply grateful to Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon, an old friend, and Rajamohan, another old friend and colleague and contributor to some of my scholarship in an earlier age, for gracing this occasion and agreeing to comment on the volume today. Shakti has already warned me that I'm not allowed more than 5 minutes, and I think he's serious about that. So I'm going to keep my remarks exceedingly brief and just talk about 3 features of this volume very quickly in the time that remains. First, we chose to do this volume because we felt there was an important gap in the literature. There is no one single volume that you can turn to get a comprehensive look at India's national security. And there are chapters in here, by the way, and some you may find this somewhat amusing, that I fundamentally disagree with, that shouldn't be in here. But I still think they were included simply because I believe in intellectual pluralism. That there should be 1,000 flowers should bloom, even if some of those flowers have an obnoxious aroma to them, at least to me. But it covers the entire gamut of security, from traditional to non-traditional security questions to issues of, say, environmental security, which I think environment is very important, but I don't think it's a security issue. At least I don't think so. But my two junior colleagues insisted that there should be a chapter on the environment, and I deferred to them. After all, they are my former students, and they know more than I do. So it fills an important gap in the literature. The second, in the same vein, it includes a range of theoretical and empirical perspectives. And as I mentioned earlier this week at another discussion about the book, not a launch, but a discussion about the book, it is quite extensive, but it's not exhaustive. This is not the encyclopedia of India's national security. That would be 3 times this size, and that could be used to commit murder. So we decided not to go down that route. There are some things that are left uncovered. There's no sort of feminist perspective on India's national security, and I don't apologize for it, because you can only cover so much in one volume without making it completely unwieldy and sloppy in the process. So there are some things that are missing, but for that, look for the encyclopedia of the Oxford Encyclopedia of India's National Security, which is not about to happen. Finally, one of the things that we also tried to do in this volume, and I think in large measure we succeeded, in considerable part because of my two co-editors, is that none of these chapters are trapped in particular moments. They don't simply talk about what's happening in terms of India's national security in 2018. Instead, there is a serious attempt to think about how national security is going to evolve in a particular area. What are the trend lines? What are the likely possibilities? What are the likely avenues by which national security is going to evolve in particular areas? So our hope is, and certainly I'm sure Oxford cares about this deeply, that this will not become obsolete next year, that students can still read it 5 years from now and profit from it, even though events will have overtaken the book. There's no question about it. But nevertheless, for example, with Raji Rajagopalan's chapter here on space security, she talks about how India's space policy is likely to evolve, what factors are likely to shape India's space policy in the future, and what are the challenges that India's space policy confronts. So it's not simply about this week ISRO launched such and such satellite. She does not trap herself in the moment. Instead, it's very much a prospective volume and a prospective chapter. I should also mention that we have another contributor, Professor Siddharth Mallavarapu, who wrote one of the key chapters at the very beginning. We have provided 3 distinctive perspectives on India's national security, and we were fortunate enough in having him contribute one of those 3 central leading chapters, and for which I am grateful to both of you for your contributions. It's a pity that more of our contributors could not be present here this evening, but they're here in spirit. On that note, let me turn it over to Nicola.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to join Sumit in thanking obviously New Memorial Museum Library and Sri Shakti Sinath for hosting us for this panel. I want to thank OUP for helping us for the last 3-4 years pushing for this project, and it's incredible to see the final output, the final product, and the distinguished, obviously, discussants, panelists, who I hope we can have a interesting discussion afterwards, because I feel that I'm overwhelmed by their security expertise and credentials. I'm just a newcomer to the study of India's national security, and I hope to learn from this discussion and from commentaries and criticisms, especially on the chapter on strategic culture. So I hope to hear a lot from you about this. As Sumit saying, Sumit emphasized a lot of different varying threats that we try to emphasize in the book. Some of them that are old. When we think about external threats, rivalries with China, Pakistan, terrorism, internal threats, secessionist movements, or internal terrorism, and also what we call the new type of threats, which expand beyond the traditional definition of security. I'm thinking environmental security, economic security, energy security, cyber security, space security, were just some of the interesting new chapters that are new domains that the Indian state has had to increasingly take into account as it manages provides security to its own territory, its citizens, etc. So, but rather, and obviously we're also talking in the book about the potential. So going the future security challenges, right? The cyber domain and the space domain are new security dimensions in flux. So how is the Indian government going to be able to deal with this? Who are the actors that are going to be involved? It's probably not just the Indian state. It's going to be a lot of private actors, NGOs, economic actors, but private economic actors, or also international organizations. Multi-stakeholderism is going to obviously be something important. But what we tried in the book, rather than just listing a list, could be an unending list of security threats, what we asked the authors, and they followed this very rigorously, was to evaluate whether and to what extent the Indian state had acknowledged all these different security challenges, right? And how it managed them over time. So the Indian state, as we see in most of the chapters, has taken into account some of these challenges, has assessed these challenges. And what's interesting in the book is try to see how the Indian state has prioritized some of these challenges over time. The added value, I think, of this comprehensive handbook is to be able to compare the role of the state in managing national security across many issues and over time. You see all the books starting in 1947 or even before, when we talk about the colonial legacy chapter, all the way to today, and also with future implications for India's security. So we should look at what Indian capacities are to deal with these issues, but also how effective the Indian state has been to mobilize its capacities to deal with these both old and new security issues. And a lot of these issues, as I said, require not just only the Indian state capacities. There's a lot of international actors, bilateral, regional, multilateral efforts that are needed. I can just quote, for instance, Modi's push for the states to collaborate and to ensure that the digital domain doesn't become a playground for terrorism and radicalization. That's just one example of how these issues are becoming transnational and how the Indian government is evolving and trying to push for new solutions that go beyond the Indian state. If you look at the book organization, Sumit mentioned the initial first section that looks at three conceptual lenses to look at the evolution of all the Indian state that look at security, the realistic or the neoclassical realistic that Sumit has written. We have the liberal international type of approach, liberal approach by Ian Hall, and constructivist approach by Siddharth. So three different conceptual lenses, some debates in that particular section between what should be maybe the lens that we should prioritize to look at certain issue areas over time, depending, again, obviously it's dependent on certain security issues, certain personalities, certain institutions. And what you notice beyond that, we have also divided the book in what we call basically two dichotomies. There's the external versus the internal type of threats. So external is more, the dealing with the, mostly territorial issues, territorial disputes with China and Pakistan, transnational cross-border type of terrorism, insurgencies also that has also cross-border implications, and with internal security issues that can be again, secessionism, but also terrorism at the national level, and all these new issues that I mentioned. And then there's the traditional versus the non-traditional. So I was mentioned the traditional is mostly about peace and cooperation at the international level, about how the Indian state has been able to deal with internal order, managing internal order, policing the Indian territory, but also there's new non-traditional issues that I've mentioned: environment, energy, economic security, etc. So again, there's a long list of chapters about this. And also, if you notice, there's another new last section, which I think is really important, that we've added in there that is linked to India's rise, both the objective rise, India's rise in material capacities, economic, military, but also about India perceiving of itself also as a rising power. So the statement, for instance, by Prime Minister Singh about India being a net security provider beyond the immediate neighborhood in the Indian Ocean is also very important about, India also perceiving its security role in a broader, more expansive way, and also the perception of other states about what the security role of the Indian government should be. So that's also something we look at, obviously, in that last section. You have a series of chapters about the expansion of India's security sphere. Very briefly, I'll give a conceptual note, hopefully, to raise a little bit curiosity about the book and how we define national security. Ms. Sri Sina obviously mentioned about what the conceptualization of security could be problematic if we keep expanding it, but I think we tried to, in line with a lot of the state of the international security studies literature, we've tried to expand the concept in three ways. First, we moved beyond the original conception of traditional security that I already mentioned to add economic, societal, political, environmental threats, also as by being part of the domain of academic empirical inquiry. So there's all these issues I mentioned that we look at. I forgot also to mention migration is security, crime, international crime, piracy are also some important issues that haven't been addressed by the security literature too much that we address in this book. And the second difference is we move also beyond the classic state-centric view of security to include the role of non-state actors, international regional organizations, also in creating security challenges, but also in mitigating some of these security problems. A lot of the non-state actors have to be involved into dealing with certain security problems. Third, and this is where we disagreed, Manjeet and me, and with a little bit with Sumit, is we also think that we closely linked to the question of what security is or not is the question of how security can be achieved. So the definition of security and security problems can itself be a highly political process, right? That involves organizational, individual, and partisan preferences, interest. So how we define security problems, when we define them, we also outline the role, the responsibilities of certain individuals, groups, institutions. So how we think about the security and what constitutes a secure environment is also determines what specific security policies can be advocated. So what levels of threats can be tolerated, for instance? I think a lot of the chapters address these issues, these questions. What are the responsibilities of the state? How does the security role of the state interact or possibly conflict with the liberal democratic institutions of the Indian state, right? So that's, for instance, issues that are addressed by the chapter on liberalism from Ian Ault, but also the civil-military relations chapter from Wilkinson, the chapters on insurgency and counterinsurgency by Shivaji Mukherjee and Paul Stanilin. So those are obviously a very important issue, and as the Aadhaar controversy moves on, and our Prime Minister Modi talking about openness and national security can go together, we see these debates are very salient and important and very addressed already in this in various chapters in this book. So, and you see that the questions that I've just mentioned, the chapters, because of the different issue areas we engage, the different theoretical, epistemological, and methodological backgrounds, they provide very different answers to all these questions. So it is imperative for us to include such diverse perspective. And one final note, I know I'm going maybe way over time, is I talked about security as a concept more generally, but briefly about the concept of its national security more specifically. Because there's two conceptions that exist in the literature, and I think our authors, our contributors have addressed in the book. There's first the traditional Weberian sense of national security, refers to the organized political violence that serves to protect the vital interests of the state, argued by realist scholars, historical sociologists like Charles Tilly, that the national security state needs to protect its national borders, its physical assets, its national citizens through policing or military means. So in this narrow sense, security is achieved from the acquisition and building of robust military or internal security capacities. Now we show in the book that the state has other obligations beyond the provision of internal order and external security and war insurgency. It's also non-traditional security issues. And there's a second conception maybe of national security state, which is a little more important, and I think all of the authors have addressed this issue, is that since India is a relatively new state, it's also important to look at historical experiences, crises, threats that have affected both the centrality of the pursuit of national security to the state mission, and how the state as a central unit of analysis has evolved in its international pursuit of security. So the Indian national security state is not a monolithic and static. It is basically a patchwork of a lot of different institutions, both historically designed in early post-independence years, and a lot of them created to deal with these new security issues. So it's important to look at these varying institutions which collectively constitute together the national security state. And so a lot of the chapters focus on the institutional design and evolution of the specific defense organization. And so this is where we also look at this kind of conceptualization of the national security state and these two different definitions, one more static and one more evolving fluid, as these bunch of patchwork, an ensemble of different institutions evolving over time to deal with the new evolving nature of security challenges. So that's where I'll end up with this theoretical and conceptual note, which hopefully encourage you to understand the organization, the objectives of the book, and to read it. So I'll be happy to answer questions based on these.
Thank you, and good evening, everybody. And thank you for being here this evening, taking the time off from your schedules. It's much appreciated. Before I deliver my remarks, I would like to acknowledge thanks to Director Shakti Sinha and the Nehru Memorial Library and his team, including Iqbal Ahmed, for making this event happen today, and also to OUP. There are a bunch of individuals who I would like to thank personally. My task has been made somewhat easier by two of my co-editors actually speaking before me. So I'm going to keep my remarks very short. I just want to tell you a little bit about the book and how it actually happened. And I want to thank all the individuals and organizations along the way who made this project happen. In 2016, we actually had an author's workshop in Bloomington, Indiana, where, of course, SUMIT teaches and where NICOLAS and I went to graduate school. And there are a number of organizations there who made this event happen. SUMIT was then leading the Center on American and Global Security. And I must add that a part of my graduate school funding came from that organization as well. But that center helped organize the conference, but it was funded by a number of other entities at Indiana University, including the Department of Political Science, the Office of the Executive Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, the Office of the Vice President for Research, the Office of the Vice President for International Affairs, and the East Asian Studies Center at Indiana. Then we got in touch with OUP, and we have worked with a number of wonderful individuals over the course of the past 2 years or so, and they have been a fantastic and fabulous team. They've produced this very beautiful volume, and they've taken care of the details for today's event. Fabulous work, so much appreciated. We began working with Jay Prasad and Tressa Benjamin, and then we worked through the entire army that is OUP, including Ranjini Majumdar, Chirag Thakkar, Rekha Natarajan, Naveen Chaudhary, Prasanna Chatterjee, Ipi Khurana, Shivangi Sharma, and Mazula Banerjee. I should also add that in addition to thanking my two co-editors, we also need to thank all of our wonderful authors. And I must note that our wonderful authors are from 13 different countries. We have 26 different chapters, 25 substantive, and 1 introduction. And they are literally from all time zones and all corners of the world. I'm just going to list the countries. India, of course, the United States, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, Canada, Brazil, Switzerland, Germany, the UK, France, and Japan. So clearly, India's national security is of great interest to individuals and scholars and universities from all over the world. I should also add that my own travels to Bloomington, Indiana, and partially to New Delhi on this trip were funded by the New Zealand India Research Institute. So all of these various entities and organizations have helped us, so we are very grateful for that. And last but not the least, I would like to thank our two discussants for today, Ambassador Menon and Dr. Raja Mohan, for being here, and I look forward to their remarks and to having a wonderful discussion. So thank you, everybody.
On a lighter note, presumably that goes to all the people whom you've thanked. The thanking part, you can upload it so that everybody who supported you comes to know about it. Because that's important. At the end of the day, the number of people who have contributed to the book is amazing. That's important. So let's start the discussion, and I'm sure the discussants will raise specific points to the general comments, of course, but specific points they would need. So Rajamohan, could you request Dr. Rajamohan to start the proceedings?
I've asked Shakti to jump the queue ahead of Ambassador Menon because I thought both Ambassador Menon was a former national security advisor and Shakti are the only two on the panel who actually dealt with the real world. I mean, of actually doing things in the government. So both Ambassador Menon's remarks as well as Shakti's remarks, I think, would round up, I think, in a more grounded sense of where the real challenges are and how you bridge the theory and praxis. What I thought I would do is really to offer, I mean, 3 commendations and 1 criticism, or not, you know, yeah, okay, very Chinese. That it's not a criticism in a sense of, you know, most reviewers always you attack the authors for what they did not do. So that's a familiar trick. That's not what I'm doing. I thought that to bring in a measure of complementarity, you know, of where the challenges for us as we look ahead on the national security discourse. The first commendation, I mean, I think to Oxford University Press, I think, as you can see, a fabulously produced volume. And I've seen, I mean, I think the series itself, I mean, is a very, very impressive achievement. I mean, I think that you have Oxford handbooks today from medicine to music, from security to spiritualism, I mean, you name it, that to be able to generate knowledge, I mean, bring together knowledge, not generate, to accessible to ordinary people, I think is a great contribution. Because I think we're living in an age where the knowledge, certainly information, produced in 1 decade could be more than the previous history of humankind. That is the scale of the exponential expansion of information, knowledge, and analysis. So therefore, and our ability to absorb it is shrinking as the scale of the knowledge that's being generated dramatically expands. Our ability to understand, assess, and use it in any reasonable way begins to decline. I mean, 140 characters, I don't know, I believe they've expanded to 280. But the ability to read things, I mean, I think is declining. So therefore, to have a series that actually brings the latest knowledge to accessible to large number of people, not just to academics or students, but actually of practitioners, of those who are in the government and those who are outside who want to use that information. So I think that is a great contribution. The second, I think, commendation is to Sumit and his colleagues, at least from my generation, those who came to international relations in the 70s. Sumit certainly has done one of the greatest contributions over the last 30 years. Is really extraordinary productive work on India's international relations, on India's security. So it's really an achievement, and I think Sumit deserves a lot of credit. He's also trained a lot of the younger people, and I think 2 of them are here, his co-authors. As he said, both NICOLAS and MANJEET, that it is a new generation that's coming, and if you open the authors list here, a whole lot of new people are beginning to write, and I think I think we have really, is fantastic to see so many young people today. The community, the cohort dealing with national security has certainly dramatically expanded, and I think that's a huge success in its own way. I mean, we might not have been able to do it consciously, but across the world today, the number of people who are studying India, South Asia is growing, and a lot of them are here in this volume, so that makes it quite special. The third aspect, I think, the book, I think the authors have already talked about it, that while the demand for national security is growing, and the number of people who are engaged in it is expanding, there is no place where you can actually have a heuristic device, or shall we say, a framework which you can start with. Shakti is an IAS officer, he's posted in Andamans. I mean, he's doing it, I mean, depending on his intellect, his interest, and his skill. Everything is by learning, by doing. So there is no place to go to. I mean, if you're a police officer in Jammu and Kashmir, another officer in Northeast, or you're dealing with, Gadchiroli, the Naxalite insurgency, wherever you are, there is no intellectual capital to fall back upon. So each one is learning on his own, and there's no transmutation of the knowledge from one group of, decision makers, bureaucrats, those who act on the ground, to the next generation. And that's where I think having a book, I mean, I think if there is at least one book today, hopefully it's not the last, and there'll be a lot more, that will actually, someone who's interested can at least start somewhere and say, look, I'm interested in civil-military relations. Look, I'm sitting in Nehru Memorial. It used to be the house where Lord Kitchener sat. The President's estate is where Curzon sat. Anyone with a sense of what is the evolution of civil-military relations, that you need somewhere to start. For example, I think that's where the chapter on civil-military relations, Steve Wilkinson is in a fabulous book on India's civil-military relations. So I think there is a place to start from, whether it's IAS, guys who are writing the IAS exam, or the guys who are, actually in the government on their own and sitting in some outpost, some remote corner of India, to be able to reflect on, for him to use the existing knowledge. I think it's a fantastic contribution. And as the authors rightly pointed out, there is no attempt at imposing one particular view. It's eclectic. It's a Catholic church that you can have multiple views on the canon, shall we say, and therefore it's actually quite rich, and the way it is written to, as Shakti pointed out, in reasonable bite-sized chapters, so that you're not going to sleep after the first few pages. So I think, let me congratulate the three authors. In terms of the one set of comments I wanted to make was really, it's my favorite gripe, which is not as meant as the three political scientists are sitting here, that essentially too much political science and too little history. That we have, that political science offers a way of parsing the current problems. But part of the problem is that you're analyzing concepts, you're contending schools of thought within political science. But I think we do not have, I think, the tragedy, I think, for us, certainly in India and in most places, that you're not sufficiently informed of the historic legacy and context in which the current theory operates, or where the current decision making is taking place. And I think with each passing year, what seemed a lived experience for me or for Mr. Menon, which is, there was something called the Soviet Union. Okay, we all grew up as the central feature of our life. But today for these guys, I mean, it's not even a footnote. I mean, it doesn't relate to you, but it is very much part of our experience of how we thought about the world. So therefore, not to have significant inputs of history, our understanding remains fairly limited if we use only the lens of political science. The chapter certainly has a thing on the colonial legacy, which is interesting. I wish there were a few more. I mean, it's not just, I think partly this, again, I'll get into trouble here with this, that when you say colonial legacy, when you're automatically applying a pejorative framework to understand what happened. It's all colonial, dismiss it. There are three guys standing outside this building called Teen Murti, right? Until Mr. Modi showed up one day with the Israeli Prime Minister, nobody was interested in who those three guys were. But who were those three guys? The three princely states which sent troops to Haifa to liberate, Palestine from the occupation of the Axis powers. So therefore, you have actually each passing day, this history becomes distant from us. And that if you don't introduce that history, I mean, that it's not that you write separate chapters on history, but you should be able to integrate that historical knowledge to our understanding of contemporary security. I mean, I won't go too much into this point, but I just take one or 2 points. I mean, I think this idea when India got formed, that it might be the colonial period, but when did India become territorial? Because the first question for a national security is, when do you become a state from out of a territory? It was always a territory, it was a civilization state, blah, blah, blah. But when did it become a state in a modern sense? I'm not talking about the very historic parts. That it is when the East India Company became a territorial entity with the acquisition of the 24 Parganas in Bengal. That's when it begins to collect revenue, it begins to operate. It creates the services today we know, the foreign service, which is the political department, which was the administrative service, the revenue service. When you create a modern European entity, becomes a state out of a territorial entity, many of our institutions today, whether it was armed forces, your bureaucracy, all can trace back to the late 18th century when many of these institutions were created. And the DNA, when of course you can go into the debate about genes versus environment stuff, and the regimes have changed in between, continue to change. But the fact is, there's some element of the DNA that how were these institutions created? What was the basis on which IB, for example, was created? Because they still don't have a legal basis for it, but the fact is, it was created within the system at a given point of time. So today you talk about insurgencies. Why were these highlands of India not occupied by any of the major empire builders in South Asia? Talk about the Naxalite threat today. It again goes back to the upper region, the mountain regions. Certainly they were also called agencies. It's very interesting. there was a Northwest Frontier Agency, there was a Northeast Frontier Agency, there's where I came from, Andhra, there was a Srikakulam Agency. The tribal areas, how the British dealt with those regions. So you didn't have India, it didn't exist. India was like Swiss cheese, there were a lot of holes. There was the British India on the coast, in the Gangetic Plain, you had the princely states, you had the tribal agencies, and on the frontier, it was even more complicated. So the structure of whether the territorial state that the British constructed, and the principles that were used, no outside power should come in, how you relate to the tribals on your border, how you relate to the tribals inside your country, all these was structured within the colonial period. So it's not, so unless we go more into those arrangements, our challenges today become harder to deal with. So it's not to say that there should be less political science. All I'm saying is there should be more history. That can make the political science a lot better in understanding. So I would think that just one last thought. I mean, the book has an interesting chapter on migration. So there's a reference to partition. Now, if we don't, I mean, it doesn't register sitting in Delhi, but the partition of Bengal created a structure where what is the problems in Assam today, the extraordinary situation that you have, the movement of multiple sets of people across what the newly created sovereignties and territorial frontiers. These were in our lifetime, I mean, at least for the older people, that these are problems out there, but they don't figure. Today you just say it's a non-military, non-conventional threat, migration. But then it is, if you don't locate it in its historic context, and I think we have huge problems, therefore, in a much broader sense, the partition of Bengal and Punjab. You say river water disputes today. Where do they come from? How were the partition organized to Punjab and Bengal? What are the sources of the problems that were dealt with? So here I think there's a lot of rich material out there waiting for the political scientists to tap and to delve into, which would make our understanding of foreign policy and national security a lot more complicated. I'm going to stop with just one example. There is a new author called Sunil Amrit. I don't know how many of you have heard of him. He wrote this book called Crossing the Bay of Bengal. He's just writing a book on how modern India dealt with monsoon. What did the Indian Meteorological Department think about the monsoon 100 years ago? What was the relationship to agriculture, in food security? So therefore, and that he's just sitting into an archives and you're reviewing how did modern India think about the monsoons. So I think a lot of these can feed into our understanding. There, I think, I don't know how many of you read Shankar Benen's review of a book, Berenice, she has a double-barrel, complicated French Anglo name. Yeah. Now, she went to Assam, sat in the archives, looked at how did the Indian state expand into Arunachal Pradesh. It's a straightforward narrative, a historical narrative of how the Indian state expanded into Arunachal Pradesh. And that Arunachal Pradesh, till Rajiv Gandhi came, was still treated as a separate entity. So for a long time, it was also under the Foreign Office. It tells you something about it. That today, that we need to dig into that history to be able to deal with the challenges that we have. So I would hope that the Sumit and his colleague successors would be able to integrate that in a much better form, and there is a huge amount of work to be done. So as I said, more history, less political science, but together they could produce, I think, a lot better understanding of national security.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you very much. That was very instructive. Mr. Menon, could I request you?
Thank you. I'm very tempted to throw this away and reply to Raja, but maybe I shouldn't. But frankly, when I read this book, I realized I'm getting old, because I'm so grateful to these three gentlemen for getting some of the world's best scholars together, convening them, getting to write about all the aspects of national security, and in a serious academic way, in a sense, to give us the greatest hits in one volume, and frankly, it's something we've needed for a long time. There's a lot of books like this on foreign policy, but nobody's ever done this on national security in the past. And which is why I really must congratulate you on what you've achieved. I also think it's remarkable because it's very rare for academics to be eclectic about theory. I mean, to accept that, yes, you can have a realist view, a liberal view, a constructivist view, but then to apply all in the course of writing this book, of letting people, that kind of tolerance, it must be because it's about India. I mean, I assume that this is the only, But we need a book like this. And we need a book like this because, frankly, we're in an unprecedented situation. If you look around us, and the book makes this clear, today there is no external existential threat to India. If there's any existential threat, it's internal, it's we, nobody else. And if you look at it over time, frankly, by any metric of hard power, we have improved our position vis-a-vis every country in the world except China. I mean, China grew faster, stronger, much bigger than us. And yet, if you ask the average Indian, and not just the average Indian, ask in government anywhere, people will tell you that they feel much more insecure than they ever were before. Why? I think because two things have happened. One is, as the book makes clear, our definition of security has grown. It's now become human security. It includes all kinds of, our expectation of the state has grown. We expect much more. Our standards, the measures that we measure security against have gone up steadily. I suppose this is progress, but the result is you feel less secure. But the other is something of a paradox. While we've improved our position, we are today, as India, much more dependent on the rest of the world than we ever have been in history. When we started reform in '91, I love to use this, about 15.3% of our GDP was external merchandise trade. By 2014, it was up to 49.3%. Think of that. Almost half your GDP depended on your external merchandise trade, not services, nothing, with the rest of the world. So your dependence on the world for everything, I mean, not just for essential maintenance imports, for fertilizer, for all the non-ferrous metals we don't have, etc., but for access to markets, for energy, you name it, has gone up to a point where, and I think that makes you nervous, because you no longer feel that you're in control of you've expanded your definition of security. It now includes energy security, all these things. And yet you feel your ability somehow to manage this is lower than before. And this is, when you add to this all the new security agenda issues, you know, global commons are contested, whether it's cyberspace, outer space, the high seas, and all these are covered in the volume. This is what I find amazing, that they've actually managed to get it into a book that you can carry. And you see the nature of power, of violence changing also over time. And there's a good analysis of that in the book, what ICT has done, what social media has done to create a sense of insecurity and to increase demands. And it actually, if you look at it in India objectively though, all the measures of violence have actually declined in this century, except since 2012, communal violence and crimes against the person, social violence, have increased. We still have one of the lowest crime rates per 1,000 population in the world, us and China. But we are very aware that it's been climbing, and it's been climbing now for 6 years at least. And traditional policing and state structures no longer can cope with this. So the sense that somehow, why is this happening? Some of it is examined here, but I would have liked a broader discussion actually somewhere, where we don't just look at it as a security problem, but how does rapid urbanization tie into this problem, what it does to our society, politics, and you know, there's a bit of sociology, anthropology that I think we need to bring into this. Because if you think of it, the figures are quite frightening. And this is not unique to India. 70% of the world's population lives within 200 miles of the sea. By 2025, 75% of the world's population will be urban. 70% of China's population will be urban. We will be more than half our population will be urban. Which means that we have moved people within a generation, a huge number of people, away from their traditional social structures, their ideological, the other structures which actually supported them. You've created a whole new urban, well, I don't want to say alienated, but people who are alone in a very strange environment, completely new to themselves. What does it do? It converts politics into mass psychology or even mob psychology, and people are open to ideology, good or bad. I mean, I'm not saying it's necessarily bad, but it's just that this is a whole new situation. This is why you see social violence, why we react to what we see around us when we see the kinds of issues. Rape is only the most obvious, but there's a whole series of things that agitate us. And traditional means don't cope with this. So where do we go? Now, unless we have some theoretical framework, as Raja said, we need a heuristic. We need some way of looking at these things. And that's why we need books like this, because it teaches us how to think about the problem. Not that it gives you the answer, not that it tells you everything, but it at least tells you, starts you on the path of thinking about it, wherever you may be. And that's why it's so, and I was really struck reading the book that how irrelevant the traditional part of the state really is to most of the security issues that we now face or that we will face in the years to come. And it's really quite a revelation reading the book. There are, of course, huge bits that I disagree with. I mean, that goes without saying, but that's the whole point of the book. I mean, it's supposed to provoke you into thinking. You know, there's several references to measuring state capacity. And this is where my grouse with political science is. I really think that political science walks around with an inferiority complex vis-a-vis science. Why do you call yourself political science? You're not. Historians study history, geographers study geography. You used to study politics. But ever since you became data-driven political science, you're no longer in touch with reality. Anyway, that's my grouse. But how do you measure state capacity? I mean, for me, frankly, the biggest factor in state capacity is human capacity, human quality, and the quality of mind that you bring to bear on issues. I mean, for any practitioner, Shakti and me, that's what really matters. How do you measure that? You can't do this, you know, quantify. So for me, there's a whole problem here, which, anyway, but that's my grouse. It also has some myths, or not the book, but some of the authors perpetuate some of the myths about Indian statecraft, that there's some Indian aversion to the use of force. You know, if you look at the record, through the 50s and 60s, there isn't a boundary we haven't violated. Maybe not publicly, but everybody knows. There's also this myth that somehow we don't get involved with our neighbors. We have nothing to do. You know, we're good propagandists, but you don't have to believe what we say. I mean, there's a point beyond which you need to. We have somebody here, Constantino, who's done a PhD on this, and I hope he publishes it, because I think that will finally put a stake through the heart of this myth. But, you know, that's the point of the book, that it provokes you to think, it makes you look at things afresh. And I really like this broad and eclectic definition of national security. And the chapter I would recommend to everybody is Nicolas BLAREL's chapter on strategic culture, which, thank you. And that's not the only reason why, because, but the big question to me is, how do we turn analyses like this, I mean, or the habits of thought, into policy, into public policy? And that, I have no answer. I wish I had an answer. I should have an answer. Maybe Shakti will answer that. But thank you. Thank you for giving us this book.
Thank you very much. I won't take time, just a couple of minutes maybe. Just provoked by the two discussions. One, of course, is on state, and I'll start with the state capacity point. The trouble with some of the crime reporting is, unfortunately, the greater faith I have in the system, the more crimes get reported. So in that sense, a longer term view sometimes is more helpful. It's a joke that if you get a good SP in a district, next year crime figures are much higher. Not because crime has gone up, people's faith in the system goes up. So which is why using metrics to determine state capacity it's not a very comforting thought, though I guess for political scientists it is required. On the historical issue, I think Raju raised, and you raised the point about his chapter. One, I think, Nicola, you're trying to establish a causal link between, say, a historical fact or a cultural artifact or a thought into a specific policy direction today. And I think that is, obviously will be very, very difficult to do. But then we should go beyond the Arthashastra. Arthashastra, of course, is important. I would even go to the Mahabharata, the Shanti Parv. I would go to the Valmiki Ramayana, when Ram is being told what a good ruler is. I would go to what the early Mughals were doing when they were translating everything from Sanskrit into Farsi. They were translating everything because they also realized that in India you must become a Chakravarti. So they were trying, so there is a certain driving force there, which obviously to establish a causal link, and you're right that yes, ideational is important. I mean, I'll tell you, I'm not letting out a state secret, in 98 when the BJP came to power, a lot of Americans wanted to know whether India would test or not test. And the ultimate conclusion to them was, no, Mr. Vajpayee is a realist, and therefore he will not test. What they forgot is that for Mr. Vajpayee, nuclear weapons was an article of faith. Irrespective of the consequences, he would test. Wanted to test in 96, we were not enough time. I remember locating Abdul Kalam in Calcutta at 2 o'clock at night and calling him to Delhi early in the morning, But there was not enough time. So in that sense, ideational processes are very, very important. You're absolutely right, And therefore the framework business does make me a little uncomfortable at times, While they are required, they're absolutely required, but the historical facts, now our boundaries of states and provinces, till our recent 10 years experiments, have been frozen in time. When a Mughal governor sails from Agra to Murshidabad, his boat ship goes along, at Allahabad enters the Ganga, at Buxar he says, I'm entering Subeh Bihar, at Rajmahal Hills he says, I'm leaving Subeh Bihar. That was the boundaries of Bihar till very recently. So hundreds of years, it's not just the Raj, it's not just the Raj, it goes beyond the Raj even, in terms of the administrative structure at the district level. And where I think either Wilkinson or you have got it slightly, I don't disagree, is the fact that the British Raj disrupted the traditional method of ruling. The Mughals, the Guptas, the Mauryas negotiated with the local kings, gave and take, and let him continue. Did not displace. But the Brits actually displaced and actually brought along much greater insecurity whenever they took over power, which is why you got the Thuggi and the Pindari phenomena, which did not exist before them. They actually undercut every single local established institution because they didn't simply understand it, So actually that brought in more insecurity rather than Raj as the Pax, what's the word for peace? Pax means peace, sorry. So it was not Pax Britannica, I'm getting old. It was not Pax Britannica, it was a violent Britannica, And that obviously has had an impact, and the discontinuities it brought in. The Macaulay thing, whatever, yes, English we need, I'm glad for that. But the discontinuities meant that we actually lost track of our institutional memory. So it's not that we didn't have institutional memory, we just lost them fairly recently. And that, I guess, would figure in. Let me not take more of your time. We have had excellent presentations. We are now open up. Ladies and gentlemen. And while some of us have had the advantage of speaking a little longer, ladies and gentlemen, in your questions, I would request you to be a little brief so that we can hear as many people as possible.